was a freshman in high school, a good 2 decades plus ago, one of the requirements at my high school is that we had to take a swim class. And I took the swim class, and a part of the swim class final, it was required that we get in the pool with all of our clothes on, and I had to have my swimming trunks underneath. And they asked every kid in the class, a part of the final, to take off their pants while in the water, because their swimming trunks are underneath, and turn their pants into a flotation device and basically tread water for 30 minutes. It's like, this was a thing in high school. This was a thing in high school. And after a while, treading in water, it's not a big deal. But for a 15-year-old asthmatic boy like myself's body, it was just like, this is really hard, guys. And it was for a certain period of time. So then I decided to look up facts on people who have won world records in treading in water. So I found a couple. You ready for this? Some of you are like, this is what we're talking about? This is what, really? Yes, great, here we go. I found this one fact that a 24-year-old Kurdish man broke Iran's record by treading in water only using his feet for 18 hours and 18 minutes. Which is pretty impressive. A man in Cuba in 2019 treaded water while balancing a football on his head for 19 minutes and 2 seconds. This one I'm skeptical on, and I really try to dive into these facts, but I'm like, if this is true, this is amazing. The world record for treading in water, the longest, was held by a 19-year-old man from India in 1997, and he treaded in water for 85 hours. Now, interestingly enough, I looked on the world records, on Guinness Book of World Records. They don't like to hold this factor because how dangerous it is. And it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense in the sense of like some of us, when you teach your kids to swim, you don't just throw them in the water. You give them flotation devices, and then you ease them off, and then they learn to tread for 30 seconds and then a minute and so forth. But, for a lot of you, I was thinking about this in light of church, and when we ask each other, how are you doing? How are you? And we usually have a church response, I'm okay. Or maybe you'll hear responses from certain people, keeping my head above water. And the idea behind that is, well, I'm doing okay, but just like anyone who treads in water, I can only do this for so long, and this is my way of telling you I'm okay, but really, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And you can see it on a lot of people's faces because hardship has this overwhelming factor where you feel just tired all the time, where you're just wondering, like, is it ever going to get easier? In the book of James, he calls them trials. In fact, he calls them various trials. And the reason why he calls them various trials is because they come in various forms of intensity. Some of you are going through it for weeks, some of you months, some of you are like, I've been going through this for years. And in Acts chapter 27, we see Paul, who's trying to keep his head above water metaphorically and literally. Let's begin in verse 1 of Acts chapter 27. It says this. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, that they delivered Paul and some of the other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. Now, Luke is basically coming back into the picture, the author of this book, because we see the change in the personal plural pronoun. It says, we decided to sail to Italy. The fact of the matter is, Paul is on trial. He appealed to Caesar in Caesarea. He's going to Rome, and he's basically trying to show why he follows the carpenter from Nazareth. And of course, on the ship on their way to Italy, there's prisoners. More specifically, the text says one was named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. And there's no way to really understand who the specific person is in which Julius served, what unit it was, because being a part of the Augustan cohort or regiment was a title given to many people at this time. It was common for Roman soldiers to accompany the transport of criminals, of insurrectionists, those who are awaiting trial. A lot of these guys were also there because they're transporting goods and food and so forth. But a lot of the prisoners that are on this ship with Paul are facing capital punishment. They are going to Rome to be tried and killed. And for Paul, he's on this ship, and I can imagine he has this moment of, I know I'm supposed to make it to Rome. I know I'm supposed to make it. But when am I gonna die with these guys? Look what happens in verse 2. So entering a ship of the Dramatium, we put to sea, meaning we sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. Now, the Adramatium was basically the northwest coast of the Asia Minor. In just a moment, I'm going to show you guys a map to kind of give you a visual of Paul's journey to Italy, but not yet. Be patient. Some of you are really excited about maps. I can see it on your face. But anyways, a note that we should see in the text is the name Aristarchus. And we know this guy because we learned about him previously in Acts in the 19th chapter. Paul was in Ephesus, and he was among people in the city that would make shrines to Diana. Remember? Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And they start this riot. They're looking for Paul. They want to kill Paul in Acts chapter 19. And Aristarchus is the one that almost dies but does not. In fact, Paul talks about him when he wrote to the church at Colossae. Colossians 4:10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. So he was one of Paul's traveling prisoner buddies, if you will. And we'll find out more about why he traveled with him. But also Luke. Why is Luke and Aristarchus with him? What a weird thing. Why would this happen if Paul's the one on trial? Well, a lot of people believe that Luke served as his personal physician because of his Roman citizen rights and privileges. He appeals to Caesar. He can do that because he's a Roman citizen. And some believe that because he was also a Roman citizen, he could have a personal physician, which is a pretty amazing thing if you ask me. Because look what happens in verse 3. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. Again, this sounds like a weird perk that someone gets to have as a Roman citizen if they're on trial, potentially to be put to death. Notice it says Julius gave Paul this certain liberty, and that liberty was he had friends that were able to care for him. And for Paul, to receive care from his friends just couldn't come at a better time. And then it made me really think about the value of friendship. And I want you guys right now to think about someone in your life that was by your side during probably the most horrendous, terrible time that you felt most alone. And you had that one friend, or maybe that second friend, or whoever, and they were not only by your side, they walked you through whatever the process was. Friendship is something that we often take for granted. Or for a lot of us, it's like, I like being to myself. I like having my thoughts to myself. People are overwhelming sometimes. And it made me really just appreciate not just the concept of friendship, but this idea of when they're by our side during hard times. It's not going to be on the screen, but I was thinking about that verse in Proverbs 17:17. It says, a friend loves at all times. And there's something beautiful to that you can think of that friend that was by your side when no one else would be by your side. In that time when maybe you made a deliberately bad mistake, and you had that one friend that says, I know you made a mistake, but I'm still going to go through the mud with you, if you will. Don't take friendship for granted. In fact, Proverbs 27:9 says, oil and perfume make the heart glad, and the sweetness of a friend comes from his earnest counsel. Praise God for the friends that point us back to Jesus during hard times. Amen? We need that. Some of us, we don't want to hear it. Sometimes we don't want to hear it. They're like, yeah, I don't need to hear this from you. But you know what? The reality is we do. We need people to point us back to the truth of who Jesus is. And for Paul, Julius was able to give him these liberties to receive care from his friends, according to verse 3. And it wasn't like Paul paid Julius under the table to get this special treatment. He's a Roman citizen. He's able to appeal to Caesar and receive this kind of treatment. Paul had Luke to accompany him. He was allowed visitors, and we're told Aristarchus was with him as well. And so Paul, as he's given these certain liberties, I want you to notice also, and this wasn't a Roman requirement, but notice in verse 3 that Julius treated Paul kindly. And the reason why I'm pointing that out too is because it made me think about the value, not just that Christians are called to be kind to one another, to be tenderhearted and loving and forgiving one another, and we're to consider the interests of others before our own, yes, but there's something profound when you work hard at your job, when you show those who you work around that you love Jesus, and Christians can work hard. That the treatment isn't special, but because, hey, the Bible says the workman is worthy of his wage, and the Bible also says he who doesn't work doesn't eat. I think Paul received this kindness not because he was passive and lazy. I think, yes, he was a Roman citizen, but I think something stood out that Julius treated him kindly. But the craziness of Paul's life is he's in this metaphorical storm, but now he's about to embark on a literal storm. Now, I'm going to read the text right now here in verses 4-5, and then afterwards a map is going to go up on the screen. For those of you that can't see it and you need a Google on your phone, just type in Acts 27, Paul's journey. But here we go. I'm going to read the text and then you'll see it on the screen. Verse 4-5. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. Now, here's the map to give you an idea of Paul's fun journey. Now, there's Judea. This is the area near Caesarea that he's going to appeal before Caesar. And then as he makes his way up towards Syria, he's going to go left and northeast, southwest towards Lycia, and he ends up in the text in a place called Myra. Now, there's an interesting person that comes from this city that I know every single person in this room knows who this person is, and here's a hint. People love to sit on his lap during December time. You're like, that's creepy, John. I know it is. St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas came from this area. Santa! I know him. Yeah. St. Nicholas, we know him as Santa Claus. Get this, guys. He was an actual historical, real person. Did he have flying reindeers? Yes, he did. In an imaginary world where you make believe certain things. No, but he actually was a historically real person, and the Catholic Church gave him the title as a saint. History tells us he died as a martyr for Jesus. I can't go greatly deep into this topic, but if you want to learn more about St. Nicholas, go to gotquestions.com, and there's an amazing article on it. So gotquestions.com, and it's so good. It was one of those things where I wanted to talk more about it, but just for the sake of time, we couldn't. So Myra is the city that Santa was from, and Paul is there right now. And then look what happens in verse 6. Read it with me back in Acts 27. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us, there it is, the personal plural pronoun, on board. Now, keep in mind, these ships they're nothing like we know of ships today. They didn't have motors, sophisticated sonar equipment. The text tells us it was an Alexandrian ship that was supposed to make its way to Italy. It was a grain freighter. It was a ship they used to transport grain from Egypt to Italy or from all around. And typically this grain freighter, it was, in this period at least, was about 140 feet long by 36 feet wide. They were sturdy, but the thing is, because of their design, they weren't meant to sail into the wind. And we're going to see why in a moment. I'm going to read verses 7-8, and I'm going to have the map up here in a second, just to give you an idea of, again, where Paul's landing. Verse 7, when we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnistus, the wind was not permitting us to proceed, and we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon, and passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lycia. So as Paul made his way in Myra, he's making his way down, and he has to go south because of the wind is shifting to Fair Havens. And Fair Havens really is this opportune spot for them to find a place to dock where it's safe. It's near the Aegean Sea, near Greece. But the wind was so bad that they were that should have been the indication that they should have waited. And for Paul, he knows he's supposed to make it to Rome, but in his mind, you got to wonder if he's thinking I can't catch a break. And isn't that also true when you take any road trip? I remember in 1995, my family and I were driving to California because in 92 we moved here from Albuquerque, but in 95 we were visiting my dad's mom in California, and we had this little Dodge Caravan, and on the drive there, the camper shell on top flew off. And my dad, in this frustrated moment, because like any of you wouldn't be like, wow, this is exciting, you're mad. My dad pulls over, opens the door, and the door falls off. And as a kid, it's like, are we there yet? And he's like, I'm going to kill you. For Paul, it's like, man, I can't catch a break, man. Nothing is working in my favor. And the reality for a lot of, man, no one wants to hear this as Christians, but the reality is, like it or not, Christianity involves storms from time to time. Difficulty. As I said before, when I moved to South Carolina in 2012 to start a church, I noticed this drastic weather difference, first of all, on the East Coast. But what I also noticed is that the natives in South Carolina handle snow in general completely different than how Coloradans do. For us, Coloradans, whether you like it or not, snow is a part of life. Some of you, just by your faces, are in denial that it's coming. Oh, it's coming, but guess what? It's a part of life. But for South Carolinians, they approach snow like it's the end of the world. For them, they freak out. Just talk of snow. Let me equate it for you. It would be like, how do South Carolinians handle snow? Imagine if you put two cats in a pillowcase and you just started shaking it, right? And then you release the cats. That's how the South Carolinians handle snow. They're playing REM, It's the End of the World, in the background in their mind. They freak out. Legitimately freak out. And then I'm laughing when I'm there because I'm like, really? Here in Colorado, kids have to be missing for hours before school districts just delay school. 7 kids are missing today. 25-minute school delay. Still gonna have school. People handle and treat storms differently, though. It's true, right? We look at storms and maybe what you're going through right now is, as you put it, it's life's tuition. For some of you, it's like, I'm still not used to it. I don't like it. Some of you shrug your shoulders and you're just like, I guess. But some of you, you're so mad, your fist in the air and you're like, come on, I need a break. I can't catch a break and I'm just so mad. People face storms differently. But here in Acts chapter 27, the men on the boat, they've already sailed under the shelter of Crete, of Salmon, and they're passing it with difficulty. But difficulty is an understatement for what awaits them the moment they leave Lasea. Read verse 9 with me. They have no idea what's coming. Now, when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over. By the way, the fast is referring to the Day of Atonement because it's October time. And this isn't some 1,500, 2,000-year-old issue. You don't travel in the winter time because it's dangerous. And for Paul, he knows this is true, because look what happens in verse 10. Paul advised them, saying, men, I perceive this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only for the cargo and ship, but for our lives. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul had this premonition and there's final destination and I perceive we're going to die. I saw a vision. The word behind perceive gives the implication that he understood based on past experiences. Check this out. 2 Corinthians 11:25, Paul describes some of these past experiences. He says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. The idea and the point that I'm trying to make that Paul could perceive the danger to come on the basis of previous experiences. We're not supposed to do this. We do this, there's going to be loss of ship. There's going to be probably loss of our lives. We need to stay here. And for Paul to say that is a lot, because it's not like he's trying to delay the inevitable. He knows he's supposed to make it to Rome. But I don't think we're supposed to go. So how did they take his advice? Read verses 11 through 12. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. Verse 12, and because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, which it was, but they just knew they probably had a deadline, the majority advised to set sail from there also. And if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete opening toward the southwest and the northwest, and winter there. So, bad idea. This is bad advice. For Julius, he's like, no, Paul, you're wrong. We got to beat the winter winds. It's coming. The intensity is coming. We need to actually leave now. And here's the thing. God has hardwired every single person with a conscience. But also, God has hardwired us with this thing called basically common sense. Each one of us, I don't care who you are. Yes, the Bible talks about how you can sear your conscience, and that's a whole different Bible study for a different day. But the idea is he gave you this thing and this ability to have common sense. But for the men on the ship that day, it proved that they lacked discernment because the majority, as the text tells us, advised to set sail. Let's just go. So not only was Julius convinced, everyone there thought, okay, let's leave to Fairhaven. And look what happens in verse 13 as a result. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. Now at this point, they're probably like, yeah, see, I told you, Paul. We're fine. Everything's fine. And the other sailors like, yeah, now we can go to Phoenix and get in and out. Like they're all happy, high-fiving and mocking Paul until verse 14. Look what happens. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. Everyone in this room, say it with me. Say Euroclydon. You're saying it like it's a fake name. This is a real name. I've heard other people call it Euroclydon, but there's something about Euroclydon that just has this intensity to its name. By the way, I love that we still name storms. Like when I lived on the East Coast, the last storm we faced in 2015 was Joaquin. And I'm laughing at that because it's just a very non-intimidating name. Like, can you imagine reading verse 14 as that? But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Joaquin. I'm sorry if your name is Joaquin. I mean, but there's something about Euroclydon is much cooler. And as a result, this tempestuous headwind arose. Look what happens in verse 15. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. Which is basically an expression that the sailors are saying and thinking, all right, we're in Euroclydon's territory now, let her drive. And for Paul, you got to wonder if he's there just like, I hate to say, I told you so, but this is why I was trying to give you advice. Again, that's part of the tuition of life, the I told you so moments, which here's the thing that we can learn from this. And it really is a hard lesson, but we need to hear it. And I'm talking to myself here. Receiving counsel is a good thing. Contrary to us thinking we know everything, receiving counsel is a biblical thing. Proverbs 15:22 says, without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. It's good. Guys, it's good to hear another voice to help you make a decision, but here's the catch. It needs to be godly advice. It doesn't need to be Google advice. Check this out. Psalm 1:1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. That when you're trying, okay, I need advice, and you're trying to think through this, and you're filtering through all the people that you can ask questions because of their life experience and everything, the reality of the matter is that experience is important, but godly wisdom is far more valuable. To talk to someone that not only knows the word, but has a fear of the Lord in their heart. That loves his word, that wants to help you think through this. Because a lot of times we want to hear only what we want to hear. A lot of times we don't want to hear the hard truth, but we need it. Worldly advice often ends with pain and disappointment. And for Paul, he's in the ship they're entering into Euroclydon territory, and look what happens in verse 16. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. So they're approaching this island, and it's like, okay, we need temporary relief because we know we need to like take inventory. And it was common for those boats, just like today, to have those little boats called a dinghy, which is the silliest name ever, or as we hear in the text, the skiff. And as we're seeing, they take the skiff, verse 17, they had taken it on board. They used cables to undergird the ship, fearing lest they should run aground. On the Syrtis sands, they struck sail, and so were driven. So they take the skiff, because it's filling with water, they empty it, and they tied it to the ship rather than just allowing it to drag behind. Verse 18, and because they were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. Verse 19, on the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So here's Luke. He's recognizing being a part of the ship. Like, we gotta throw out the things that are not important. We gotta take inventory. And in this moment, it's like, can it get any worse? Like, can it get any worse? Look what happens in verse 20. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. During this time, they navigated by stars. This is the way that they can go from point A to point B. They didn't have a compass. They didn't have a radar system. The sea, the sun, these were their ways to indicate and understand exactly where they were geographically and where to go. We just read here in verse 20 that there was neither sun nor stars that appeared for not just many hours, but many days. And we don't even know how long that was. Was it 24 hours? Was it a week? And no small tempest beat on us. They're navigating blind, which is frustrating. And it's got to be not just frustrating, but just scary. They have no idea where they're going. And as a result, verse 20, all hope, it says, that we would be saved was finally given up. It takes a lot for someone to conclude something like that. And I don't care who you are or what your worldview is, hope is a powerful force. And the reality behind it is what we place our hope in proves to be both either reliable or detrimental. And the reality is we know people who place their hope in all sorts of things. Why do you think most people feel hopeless? And the reality behind it is because they're placing their hope in things that fail. They're placing their hope in a political party or a sexual orientation or education or job security and stock market. Or you place your hope in church leadership. Or maybe you place your hope in your marriage and family members. But the reality is, and this is hard for a pastor to say, but it's true, all of those things are going to fail you somehow. All of those things are going to disappoint you somehow. All of those things you're going to have this standard, and the standard is not going to be met. So what do we do about it? What are the men going to do about it in verse 27? In chapter 27. Their hopelessness left them to a place, let's just give up. So look what happens in verse 21. But after long absence from food, Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me. And the sailors said, not now, Paul. No, it doesn't say that. Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And I think Paul said it, I think he said it sarcastically, but I think he said it he's annoyed. But he doesn't rag on them long because he knows that they're in a state of hopelessness. He knows that they're depressed. He knows that they're thinking we're going to die here. But he's going to show them what they can place their hope in that will not fail them. Look at verse 22 through 24 with me. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. How could you know that, Paul? You didn't say that in verse 10. You didn't say that a second ago. What changed his mind? Look at verse 23. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. Verse 24, saying, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Now, I find this so fascinating that the giant faith of Paul, the spiritual giant we all just admire, I think he had a moment of doubt. And the reason why I think he had a moment of doubt is because an angel had to remind him to not be afraid. Like, really? Paul? But not Paul. We elevate certain people in our life. Like, they would never fail. Paul would never doubt. But I think an angel had to come to Paul to have him come to his senses and say, you are going to make it. God has favor on you and all the men present, and you have to make it to Rome. And you are going to make it to Rome. But I think at one point, Paul thought, but am I? We do that sometimes too. We love the promises of God. We hear from Bible studies that we hear and listen to, and when we're reading God's word and we're just like, this is amazing. But isn't it true that when the storms of life hit, that Satan wants us to be distracted or to defer our attention, not to be on the word, but onto the internet? And just get the advice from the world and try to find comfort in all these things but the word of God. But the reality is, and this is what freaks Satan out. I'm going to say it, okay? What freaks Satan now is he knows when God makes a promise, it has to happen. That doesn't mean that he plays fair. He's going to play dirty. But the reality is when God makes a proclamation, ladies and gentlemen, it will happen. It must happen. And for Paul, in that moment of crisis, an angel had to remind him of that truth. There's a little bit of Paul in us too, right? Moments of crisis. Isn't it true? It's okay. Isn't it true that we sometimes forget the promises of God? We forget that, no, he's not going to leave me or forsake me. Or no, there's no temptation beyond what I'm able to bear. He's going to provide a way of escape. He promises if I call out to him, he's going to answer. He's going to show me great and mighty things that I don't know. God's promises resonate in us and become imperative, which is why Psalm 119:11 tells us, a verse we're all too familiar with, your word I have hidden in my heart that I might not sin against you. For Paul, an angel had to remind him of God's promises. And once he was assured of this promise, listen to this bold statement by Paul in verse 25. Read it with me. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God, that it will be just as it was told me. How can you know for sure, Paul? Because I believe God. Because I believe in God. In the same way, do we believe in God over our fears and our insecurities, over the uncertainty of what lies ahead? That's the hardest, when we don't know what's ahead. But that's the power of faith. That's when we place our faith in Jesus. I don't know the outcome, but I know he's good, and I know he wants to reveal it to me. And that's easy for us to say. I mean, it really is easy to read the text, see the simplicity of it, and forget that in real life, when you tell someone to place their hope and trust in Jesus, to believe him, that you'll often get a skeptical response from people like, really? Really? You think God cares about me? You actually believe that? How can you be so certain? And for Paul, I would imagine he would say something like, because I have believed God up to this point, and he's proven to be true up to this point, every way. And what are those promises that God made? What is the promise? We learned about it a couple weeks ago. Acts 23:11, I'll read it to you. What is this promise? The promise is that the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. How do you know we're going to get out of this? Because I was told, and if God makes a promise, then it's going to happen. His confidence was driven by the knowledge that God's word is unchangeable, and it was going to happen. And he placed all the fear that he had was replaced by the promise of God. And it made me think of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, fun fact about Mr. Abe is that he was known to be someone who loved reading the Psalms. One author describes that Abraham Lincoln, one of his personal loves, appreciations for a Bible verse was worn in his Bible for Psalm 34:4. that he would always go to this verse. And I thought, I'm going to read it to you. Psalm 34:4. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and he delivered me from all my fears. For Paul, he has a lot of reasons to be freaking out, to let fear kind of drive the ship of emotion. But he doesn't, because he believed in Jesus. And not only, he makes a declaration that is so important. I hope you noticed it in verse 23. He said, for there stood by me this night an angel of God to whom I belong. I belong to him. He's made it known that I belong to him. And in Paul's belief that he belonged to God, he knew he's going to survive. He knew his life wasn't his own, and he knew that God is going to orchestrate this to the point that he's going to make it. But even when all this hopeful praise and, maybe the sailors are like, yeah, maybe you're right. Let's do this. Let's listen to what you have to say. And then Paul makes this last statement in verse 26. However, which is always a great way, however, we must run aground on a certain island. Do you know what he's saying? Yeah, no, this is true. But guess what? We're going to have a shipwreck. Like, don't freak out. Don't freak out. The ship is going to crash, but we're going to be fine. We're going to be fine. And, you kind of giggle at it, but it's kind of one of those like, what? And the wording, which is interesting, is that he calls it a certain island, which indicates God didn't tell him which island, which again indicates that Paul had to exercise a level of faith that, well, God told me this, and he's only giving me certain things, this little information. This is what I do know. And it is for Paul, is he going to trust that God knew which island he would run aground on? Yeah, I think he did know that, like, God was in control and he can trust in him. But which island? Is it going to be like the island on Lost? Remember that awful and terrible and wonderful TV show? Let's find out what verse it is in verse 27. Oh, wait, we're not. We're going to have to stop right there. Next week, we're going to learn more about it. But I want to give you some final thoughts before I invite the worship team up. I've been thinking about this for the last week. And I want you guys to ask yourself this question. Realistically, how do we tell someone to keep their head above water, even though they know a storm is coming? How do you encourage someone to stay afloat when they see the approaching waves ready to crash in their face? Like, literally, I've been giving this a lot of thought, trying to understand really and realistically how to encourage people that are in a constant state of disbelief and discouragement. The people that are treading, fatigued, they're spiritless in their Christianity. That even I, in my optimism, I can't determine how long these people can stay afloat. This expression like, it only takes so much for a person to crack. But really, how do you stay afloat when you talk to someone that feels like they're just drowning all the time? Then it made me think. The reason why flotation devices exist is to keep us safe. And then it made me think of the story of Jesus walking on the water. I love that story. Jesus feeds the 5,000. The disciples are in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. They're freaking out. And then they see the shadowy figure walking towards them, and it's Jesus. And Peter says, if it's you, call me out. And he says, all right, come. And as Peter is walking on water, and his eyes are on Jesus, he takes a moment and he looks at the waves around him. And we know the story. What happens? Thoop. He sinks in the sea. Does Jesus laugh at him as he's on top, like, haha, I didn't sink? The Bible says, that doesn't happen, by the way, that he reached his hand out and grabbed him. And do you remember what Jesus said to Peter? Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt me? Takes him out of the water while he was on top of the water, and they entered the boat and they began worshiping and praising God. Like, legitimately, Peter, the text says, screams, save me, Lord. He doesn't scream, I'll figure it out. Save me, Lord. And it made me think about that in light of what we're learning today, that Jesus wants to be our refuge. Jesus wants to be your refuge, not some of the time, not just on Sundays. He wants you to cry out to him so that in those moments that you feel like you're drowning, not only will he save you, but he'll give you the answers you need. He becomes our refuge. In fact, I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. I'm going to give you guys one verse to think about, a verse that really stuck with me. How do I know Jesus is our refuge? Psalm 46, 1-3. It says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, even when the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. Now, I want you to understand that this psalmist right here, the reason why they're trying to consider, which is very interesting when you look at the language and the writing behind it, but they're trying to consider the most frightening, humbling natural phenomenon imaginable. That even if the earth is removed, what? Even if the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, how is that even possible? Though its waters roar and are troubled, though the mountains shake and it's swelling. And if you know the psalm, if you're familiar with the psalm, you're going to notice that in his consideration of the worst case scenario, he's reminded of God's greatness, that even his fear of the worst case scenarios of what could happen, he would not forget the awesomeness of God, that he says, God is our refuge. Even if those things are to happen, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. And some of you might feel like you're drowning right now because you've been treading for years, for decades, for weeks, and you're just like, I can't. It's so much easier just to give up. That I'm here to affirm the truth that God has not forgotten about you, and his hand extends to you. That it feels like this boat ride of life is hard, but the beauty of the Jesus walking on water story is that he meets them in the middle of the sea, right? But they're gonna end on shore eventually. The boat ride is gonna end. They're gonna make it. And for a lot of you, maybe that's what you need to hear right now. Even though it feels like giving up is easier, Jesus is always ready to be your refuge and your strength.